Right, guys, we might as well get started. I don't know if some more folks will be drifting in as we go, but we can introduce you to the folks that we have in the room right now. We don't have any virtual attendees at the moment, but again, they might be popping in. So would you like to introduce yourself? Yeah, they can see. It's up there.
I can
So,
start.
Mingla?
Yeah, hi, my name is Mingla. I'm now with Cornell University, focusing on, I'm a New York State 4-H specialist, focusing on agriculture, food system, and healthy living, and would like to make connection, part of that practices with the Native American Indigenous community.
You guys all hear that? Okay. All right.
Hi, my name is Nancy, and I'm an undergraduate student at Penn State, and I study biological engineering, and I direct the student farm club and work on the student farm. So I'm interested in our role as a land grant institution and what some of the advocacy work we can do.
You could be just the activist we're looking for. Cheryl doesn't want to introduce herself, but you all know Cheryl. And she's sitting in the room also. And you've already met Tyree. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'll let Steve go ahead and share screen. And this is the Stepping Out and Stepping Up project, stepping out of our comfort zone and stepping up to our responsibility. And Steve Gavazzi is the leader of this program, and he'll tell you how he got into this and why.
Well, I don't know if I'm the leader. I'm just the person who's going first. So I think this is a co-leadership model for sure. But I'm pleased to meet everyone. And by the way, a shout out to Penn State. That's one of my alma mater. So great to have you here. We are.
Penn State.
All right, there we go. We have to combat this OH thing that goes on all the time around here. So. I'm going to speak very quickly about a lot of material that I think is important to kind of tee all this up on. And I titled my little part of this talk, Remaining Land Grant Fierce While Accepting the Land Grant Truth of Our Foundation. And that kind of bipolar perspective is what I've been living for the last couple of years. And I'll do a brief explanation of that. Really, the story for me starts in 2016, when I started writing the book, which eventually became Land Grant Universities for the Future, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2018. It was a deep dive for me into things that I had held near and dear for, at that time, the almost 30 years that I had been at The Ohio State University. But I've really been in land grant universities all of my adult life. I started at Penn State, which is Pennsylvania's land grant, in 1979. And then I went to graduate school in 1983 at the University of Connecticut, which is Connecticut's land grant. And then fast forward to the present, and I've been here at Ohio State for 31 years. So I felt like I knew a lot about land grant universities. This was co-written with West Virginia University President Gordon Gee, who also is a two-time president at Ohio State. And I think we really covered a lot of the ground on the basics of where land grant universities came from in terms of the federal legislation and where they were headed in the next 150 years. That led to a second book that I was asked to do in response to a celebration that was going on at Ohio State. It was our sesquicentennial, our 150th birthday here at Ohio State. And this was a compilation of essays that were done as an homage to Ohio State, but also to the principles of the land grant institution, again, looking forward into the future. And that was published in 2020. Well, I really considered myself to be what I would call land grant fierce. And a student, Christian Harza, actually did a film not too long ago for the student newspaper, The Lantern, in which he had offered up this definition of being land grant fierce, talked about it as being marked by unrestrained zeal in carrying out the three-part land grant mission, which is around what it says here in the second part, being excellent in teaching, excellent in research, and excellent in community engagement activities. And so when the land grab universities report came out, and ironically, it came out the same week that I handed in the manuscript for that second book, Fulfilling the 21st Century Mission, it really was quite an earth-shaking event for me personally and professionally, as well as I think for many people who began to ask the question for the very first time, wait a second, where did the land in land grant come from? And so, you know, kudos to Kristen Atone and Bobby Lee for pulling together this as the lead co-authors, but also a myriad of other people deserve credit for creating this exposure for people for the very first time, for many people, especially, I think, non-native scholars, where exactly this land came from. Here's a map that came from the High Country News report. The Land Grab Universities report shows the approximate 108 different tribes and all of the about 660,000 acres that was appropriated from tribes and given to The Ohio State University to establish itself. Upon recognizing this, I began to immediately want to take action. John Lau, who's one of our colleagues who is part of the Newark Earthworks Center, is fond of saying that there's no shame in not knowing, but there is shame in knowing and not doing anything. And so because I'm a writer at heart, one of the things that I wanted to do from the outset was to get the word out. And so I was fortunate enough to have received an invitation from the Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal to write a piece in which right from the beginning, I was trying to talk about being able to be land grant fierce or to remain land grant fierce while accepting the fact that there really was this truth about the land grab that had happened. This in turn led to, very fortuitously, the group of us who are here with you today coming together to respond to a racial justice seed grant that President Johnson from The Ohio State University had been offering. In fact, she had put about $1 million aside for work to be done on racial justice issues. We were one of 83 applications that were submitted to this grant pool. We were the only ones that, to my knowledge, had focused on Native American issues, and we were one of the first 10 that were actually accepted and given funding. So, oh, and I should mention here, so we ended up really tossing around with our community partner, which I'll talk about in a second, what we should call ourselves. And we had plenty of different opportunities to label ourselves in a variety of different ways, but we decided to just go with stepping out and stepping up. And I want to emphasize here, what we're talking about is stepping out of our comfort zones and asking questions, obviously, to be able to become more uncomfortable and therefore learn, and to then therefore step up to our responsibilities. So if we learn things, then we ought to be able to act upon them. So hence stepping up and stepping out. So as it turns out, and we don't have the time to talk about all 4 projects that eventually came out, but we're very proud to say that The Ohio State University administratively has given us almost $250,000 through these 4 different projects to pursue the knowledge about the things that we're talking about with you today. However, we also recognize that we've probably tapped out, at least immediately, the amount of internal funding that we're going to be able to receive for this. And so we have been more busy as of late seeking external funds to keep this project going. Again, I'm flying through a lot of stuff, but we do maintain a Land Grant Truth website, and practically everything that all of us are going to be talking about today in one way, shape, or form is either on this blog that we run or is linked to this blog. So Land Grant Truth, if you type that into Google, it's the first thing that comes up. I am going to spend just the last couple of minutes of my time talking about the first project, which was again with a community partner. That community partner is First Nations Development Institute. It's the largest Indigenous run economic development institution in the country. It's led by Mike Roberts, its president and CEO. And we were fortunate to work with Mike, and just as fortunate to work with one of the Indigenous consultants there, Rick Williams. And Rick was actually the person who ended up doing the bulk of the work that we're going to talk about here on the next few slides. But the most important takeaway here is that what we were doing is we were trying to get in contact directly with those tribes whose land was taken and sold in order to fund the establishment of Ohio State as a university. So what we ended up doing was, and actually we means Rick ended up interviewing 12 leaders of those tribes whose land was taken and sold, and in addition, 12 leaders of tribal colleges. Because what we recognized, and we were doing these interviews in the midst of the beginning of the pandemic, it was very difficult to get a hold of tribal leaders. In fact, some people have talked about the fact that we got 12 interviews as a near miracle happening in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic. But it was easier for Rick, as the former head of the American Indian College Fund, to reach out to tribal college leaders. And again, we valued that to a great degree because they were serving many of the same tribes who we were trying to get in contact with through the tribal leaders. We were fortunate to have very quick access to an opportunity to write for the Tribal College Journal. And so we created this first article that was called Paying Old Debts, which were the interviews with the tribal leaders themselves. And one of the, I'm sorry, these were actually this slide is mislabeled. It's these are really the tribal college leaders. What we found from them is that they did very much want to partner with the 1862 land grants, the original Morrill Act recipients, because they really thought that there was an ability to engage in reciprocally beneficial relationships. The problem, however, as they pointed out, was that any partnerships that were there presently were very, very spotty, very tenuous in all three areas. Sometimes there were partnerships that were more focused on teaching, other times research partnerships, and then finally there were some community engagement partnerships as well. Very few places where all three aspects of the mission were actually covered in detail, however. We also had a second article that we published in Tribal College Journal, which talked about what the interviews yielded to us. And so this was a second piece that was called Let Us Tell the Story of Our Land and Place. And what we found out here, and this is just a kind of a cataloging or really quick bullet points that we found. Obviously, food insecurity, one of the biggest themes that we saw across all of these interviews. But I mean, all the things that people would absolutely imagine would be happening in terms of the kind of negative impact that the land grab had on these tribes. Again, sorry, I'm plowing through this very quickly, but just wanted to note that we have been seeking some external funding. One of them is through NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, which is part of USDA. We had submitted the idea of bringing together the 1994 tribal colleges and the 1862 land grants to talk about present and future partnerships. We reached out to practically everybody that you could possibly imagine that might have some interest in this and to be a part of this, to collaborate on this investigation. And that included AHEC, the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, and Falcon. Falcon is the conference that we're actually going to, the First Americans Land Grant Consortium, APLU, which is the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. First Nations continue to be a partner, several tribal colleges, and then all of the experiment station and extension organizations in the West and the North Central regions, as well as the rural development centers in both the West and the North Central region. We did get the grant, so if anyone is interested, we will, most of us here today will be, at least I'm sorry, some of us will be attending the Falcon Conference, and we will be putting on the post-conference, which is on October 24th. Our main task, as I've said already, is to focus on what partnerships have existed in the past, which ones are current, and what plans do people have for future partnerships. And again, there's a strong but not exclusive focus on food sovereignty and food security issues. I'm very pleased and honored that the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development also then gave us extra money through a grant to me. It was actually a faculty fellows grant to do some additional work. The North Central region, which includes 12 states, and that does include Ohio, brings together actually the largest focus on the tribal colleges. There are 36 tribal land grant colleges in total. 20 of them exist in the North Central region. So there's a very strong interest in these partnerships. What we're doing at present is documenting all of those characteristics that we can catalog in terms of what is going on in these present and past 1994, 1862 partnerships, but hopefully, again, building a platform for how to strengthen those existing partnerships, and more importantly, I think, creating new collaborations. So again, in a wrap up, what I'm trying to do in terms of helping to co-lead this process is to embrace the sense of being a land grant institution, which continues to be very important because there are major contributions that land grants continue to make in terms of the needs of communities throughout the states in which each of these land grants are designed to serve, but also accepting the land grant truth at the same time. These are not, in other words, mutually exclusive activities, but rather they are really one and the same activity as far as I'm concerned. The last thing that I wanted to just simply mention is now that we've got our feet underneath us in terms of the 1994 tribal colleges, our next step is to begin to focus on partnerships between 1890 HBCU land grants and the 1862s. And so we have developed a site that is up and running now called the Land Grant Partners Project. We have reached out now to several HBCU contacts, and we really think that by next summer, we will probably be doing very similar activities with the 1890 HBCUs that we have been doing for the past year with the 1994s. And with that, I'm way out of time, and I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn this over to Marti Chaatsmith.
Hello. I'm going to talk about first the Newark Earthworks Center. I'm the associate director there, and John Lau is the director. He couldn't be with us today. And Megan Cromwell, who is sharing this presentation with me, will also be presenting after I do. I would like to talk about the Newark Earthworks Center, which is the only university research center on Ohio State University regional campus at the Newark campus. And Newark also is the place where the Newark Earthworks exists. The Newark Earthworks are Hopewell ceremonial earthworks up for World Heritage nomination in the next 2 or 3 years. And they are sites of human genius and intellectual capability built 2,000 years ago. So we'll talk a little bit about those and the role they play, or the role they have had or shared with the outreach for tribes. I've been there at the center since 2005. I helped co-found it. And the mission is developed to bring the university community and the indigenous communities together, and the research communities of archaeology, anthropology, and now, as we do more outreach, traditional indigenous knowledge and American Indian studies, to the table to talk about what the earthworks meant and how that relates to what goes on today. The mission is we promote and support research and engagement by faculty, students, scholars, Indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders with an interest in the ancestral and contemporary Indigenous places, people, cultures, and experiences within and around Ohio. Ohio was a center of American Indian world for a while in 2,000 years ago. And since then, it was a center of activism in the 60s. And right now we are working on the land grant project. So Ohio, and it's not intuitive that Ohio is Indian country, but it certainly is and has been for a very long time. The vision for the center is that we get to promote scholarly engagement and research, contribute to the World Heritage Ohio effort, and to have the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And our values are respect, recognition, preservation, celebration, and promotion of Indigenous peoples and their achievements, past, present, and future in and around Ohio. So when we focused on the earthworks in the beginning in 2005, we did not have any tribal governments working with us at all. In fact, we tried to reach out to them. I am a citizen of the Comanche Nation and a direct descendant of the Choctaw Nation, familiar with both tribes through my family, participated in elections and so forth, but it had never, I had never had to make a call to a tribal government to ask them for anything at all or to invite them to anything at all. So it took us a while to figure out how to do that. And it turns out that the earthworks were the bridge really to how we connected with tribal governments over time. But first we had to come to an understanding about the earthworks ourselves. And we did that by basically thinking about bringing the Native voices into the conversation. Because when I first got there, when we all first got there in 2005, the main narrative about the earthworks was archaeological. And the archaeological narrative was, we're going to look at these earthworks and measure them, talk about how they were built with baskets of soil and dirt and clay, and where they were situated, and map them and know as much as we can as objects of study. And that was a necessary part of this. And there was also a sense of wonder and awe, which you can feel that when you go visit the sites. When you go on a tour with people and you're showing them the sites, you can see people really being amazed at what they see, because as you'll see, these earthworks are enormous and very precise geometrically and aligned to cosmic cycles. So we found that the archaeological narrative just simply wasn't enough. It was necessary to understand what was there and where they were there and how old they were, but it wasn't enough to understand why they were there. So we kind of systematically went through the earthworks and understanding where they came from. So I guess the big question for us was, how do we bring Native voices back to the earthworks, and how do we bring life to the earthworks? All federally recognized tribes had been removed from Ohio by 1840. So we have no tribes in the state with which to collaborate on information about the earthworks or understanding about that land. In fact, since so many tribes, 46 altogether, who were, or 40 some altogether, who were associated historically with Ohio, had left Ohio by 1840 and had started their lives in another place. If they knew about the earthworks when they left, which I am certain they did, that information had been lost over time. And the removals were very difficult. Many of the tribes scattered, had to leave the area. So it was a very difficult and traumatic time for the tribes. And what we found ourselves was reintroducing the descendants of the ancestors of the tribes who had been there in the 1840s and earlier to this area. And they themselves wanted to learn about their historic villages. So we had something in common, but we really did find that there was a erasure of Indian history and knowledge and understanding about the earthworks over time. So we first wanted to look at who built the earthworks. And the earthworks were built in 2,000 years ago. And the people who built them were American Indian people who were here. And they designed them, they planned them, they imagined them, they built them, and they made them happen. And how that happened was there was no authoritarian central city or anything like that. It was dispersed villages and settlements, people of different cultures and different groups, different tribes, as we would say today, coming together to create these places on a seasonal basis, most likely. And how we know that is archaeology tells us there were different kinds of housing around it. There were kinds of the food that would have sustained the workers and the people building it were in groupings, crop groupings, so that we have Cherry Valley and we had Goosewood and we had all these little groups of food that we now know today as different parts of the city. So this is all part of the narrative around the UNESCO World Heritage effort, which includes something called the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, which are 9 sites. And the Newark Earthworks is one of those 9 sites in a serial nomination. And then there'll be a separate World Heritage effort to bring Serpent Mound into World Heritage inscription. So these are examples of some of the earthworks. And this is the what, right? What did they build? They built geometric, precise figures. So precise images of circles. Some of them are perfect and some of them are deliberately nearly perfect. Very straight, long line embankments that are anywhere from 3 feet high to 6 feet high with a 20-foot base. They had polygons, is what we would describe them as, just shapes that don't have, a specific name. An octagon up there in the right corner is an open cornered octagon with the barrier mounds in the middle, not burial, but barrier. And so that you have to choose a way to go in. And that is connected to a perfect circle. The octagon is 50 acres and the circle is 20 acres. And the space in between with the walkway between is about the size of a football field. And here's a picture of the overall complex, 4 square miles of earthwork sites. And there were 4 major elements to the Newark earthworks, which again is just one of the 9 sets of earthworks that are in the UNESCO World Heritage designation. And each of these major figures, the great circle in the middle, center, the square that is on the right side, the what's called the ellipse or an oval on the upper right, which is a cemetery. And then to the left corner is the octagon. The octagon is an observatory for the lunar cycle, not the monthly lunar cycle, but the 18-year and 219-day lunar cycle. And this is consisting of 8 lunar alignments that occur between that 18 years and 219-day time period. It is one of the several sites in the world that observe this long lunar cycle. And another is Stonehenge, Chimney Rock, Watson Brake, Teotihuacan. There's several of these around the world because the ancient cultures understood this long lunar cycle. And what happens is that at the end there of the circle, you see kind of a little hatch. That's an observatory mound. It's about 25 feet tall. And then you sight down through, you stand there and then sight down to the very tip of the octagon on the far end. And the moon will come up at that horizon over a period of 3 years several times. And the next slide is a picture of the moonrise as we witnessed it in 2005. And we believe that possibly the moonrises were cues for activity of some kind, just as it was at Chaco Canyon. This same alignment is observed at Chaco Canyon. and triggered gatherings. And we were also a little bit moon crazy because we didn't have a tribal context. And here's a very important point, is that we needed the Indigenous understanding, the Indigenous knowledge about the lunar cycles and the seasons and the star knowledge and all of those kinds of things to put this in context. Otherwise, what we had was kind of a festival atmosphere where we would go and watch the moonrise. So we learned a very important lesson, that to bring it to have significant cultural meaning and respect the sacred nature of the sites, we need Indigenous knowledge more than we have now. So that's part of what laid the foundation for our tribal outreach projects. And the next slide is a picture of the octagon from the air. And you can see those are houses. So it's an enormous, enormous site, very fragile yet strong. So when we looked at the need for bringing tribal voices into understanding of the earthworks, we didn't have too much of a refined approach. At first it was just, can we bring any scholar, native scholars and historic tribes? But we understood from the beginning that the historic tribes probably were not the builders of the earthworks, although it's entirely possible they could have been the descendants of the ancestors who built the earthworks. But the tribes that were very dominant in Ohio tended to be from the East Coast and started migrating in after settlement. So we have different groups of tribes and tribal governments that we've been reaching out to on different bases. For example, the historic tribes currently have investment in and commitment to preserving the sites now. So they have, we have the Shawnee, who is one of the reasons that we created a tribal outreach project in the first place, because Chief Glenna Wallace, who was the first woman chief of the Shawnee, of the Eastern Shawnee, visited Ohio to visit an author who was here, and we invited her out to see the earthworks. And she had been to World Heritage sites already in her previous work as a professor. So she understood right away that she was seeing something enormous and amazing. And she hosted and funded several heritage trips to Ohio of her tribal people, of her tribal community, and also invited me down to tell Ohio in Ohio, and to tell Oklahoma and tribes in conferences there about the earthworks. So we started a relationship built on how do we preserve this together and how do we understand it together. And they went from a status of, we don't know anything about this, please tell us about it, but we know our people were there, we had villages there, we were there for hundreds of years, to we now want some stewardship responsibilities. We want to be able to be involved with what activities and events take place there, and we want a voice in what happens there. And this is an example of the way we went forward with kind of a respectful, reciprocal listening mode with the tribes. And that is what we will continue to do with the tribal outreach for the land grant. So NAGPRA, this is Chief Wallace's statement about the earthworks. And this does sum up very clearly what we take away from the earthworks, not that they are objects to look at, but that they are living spaces that had great meaning to the people who built them. And we may not understand exactly what that meaning was, but we can understand the general context of it. And she describes it very well. The people who built these mounds were brilliant. Their genius lies in combining complexity and simplicity simultaneously. And all of the sites that we saw are enormous. 1,530 feet was a standard unit of measure, and they used that standard unit of measure to build all of these sites that we see. And then also Chief Glenna connects these ancient people with the contemporary Indigenous people, so that all of us who are Indigenous share in some ways with the achievements of these wonderful architects from 2,000 years ago, and are points of pride for our youth and for ourselves in knowing that the people who built this had the same intellectual capability as we did, and were using the most recent technologies they had to build what they were doing for the purpose of a ceremonial site that probably was just like Indigenous people today, a mix of a lot of activities, trade and celebration and feasting and marriages and alliances and conflict resolution and all of those things that can happen in gatherings today. So we can move the next slide, Megan. So Ohio, the basis for our tribal outreach project was that there were some 40 tribes. At first it started with just 10, and then it multiplied over time as we learned more about the history of Ohio and tribes became interested in what we were doing. So there were about 40 some tribes that had been in Ohio over a period of time after settlement, after European settlement, and had been in the area. So Ohio had a place for us to start. And we started with the Shawnee, and then the Ohio History Connection. We went to them and said, you really need to start your own tribal outreach project because the interest here is extremely high and these are Indigenous sites and it's fair. That's how it should work. And they did. They started their own, and now they have an American Indian Relations Office, and their next tribal outreach, their next Tribal Nations Conference will have some 30 people. 30 tribes attending. And we can go to the next. So the tribal outreach for the land grant work, and more about UNESCO, yes. And then there's also a slide about resources that can be used to learn more about the sites, more about the effort, the tribes that are in Ohio. So the initial contact with the tribes brought up a lot of different issues on which we have a basis of common interest, including NAGPRA, for example. The Newark Earthworks don't have a lot of burials in all of the sites except for one, which is the cemetery. But the other sites are enormous mounds that were burials, and they were filled with funerary objects, which were looted over time and excavated in the 1890s. And they are now under the purview of NAGPRA, for example. And so the tribes are very interested in seeing that Ohio, which has among the most funerary objects that are culturally unidentifiable of any state in the country, their tribes are very interested in knowing how there can be a resolution to that. And I think there's conversations about that all the time, about how that can be resolved. The interpretation of the sites, World Heritage and stewardship are all things that came of this contact between Ohio, the Newark Earthworks Center, and the tribal governments that we were reaching out to. So when we started thinking about the tribal outreach for the land grant project, we wanted to build on the relationships that we already had. And for that, we could do that with a couple of tribes. There were a couple of tribes overlapping in our list of tribes that had lost land to the land grant for Ohio State University. I think there were 3 or 4. And so we wanted to reach out to them and offer them some aspect of what we had learned through the land grant work, treaties and what land was taken, what specific tracts of land was taken, where they were, and if it coincided with their own histories of their tribe and their movements through time. And we were able to reach out to one tribe and share with them an Airtable that Megan's going to share with you in a minute, that describes what we know about the land grant history and their tribe. And we found that this was a very keen interest to the tribal government, and especially the tribal historic preservation officers. And we would like to plan that to be a next step to reach out to the tribes. We also think that other tribes will be interested, especially woodlands tribes who are involved in the land grant theft of land, that those tribes will be very interested in the Newark earthworks and the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks, because they were there. Many of those tribes were involved. They were descended from probably the Hopewell culture, because Hopewell sites are found not just in Ohio. They're found in the Carolinas, Tennessee, Illinois, and north into Canada. So it was a very broad kind of, it's not a religion, but a very broad movement or cultural expression. And so many of the tribes that we would be involved with the land grant would be interested in it too. And it serves as a common base, that we are working with trying to preserve these indigenous places. And we're not just coming to them to ask them about, the land grant. The land grant is exceedingly important. It's a resolution of something that has been problematic for a really long time. And now, thank you to High Country News for bringing it out into the open. But this is something that we can offer that's tangible, and that we can bring Ohio State University forward in working on the land grant issue, as well as the World Heritage inscription. And in 2024, 2025 is going to be a banner year. I don't know where we'll be on the land grant project, because we are moving at such a fast pace and making such good progress. But in 2024, there will be a total eclipse of the sun. And these Ohio lands, these ancient Ohio lands, will be in the middle of the zone for that total eclipse of the sun. There will also be the World Heritage nomination should be complete by then, if not that year. So we'll have World Heritage site in Ohio that's an indigenous site in the East, one of the first. And then we'll also have at the Octagon moonrise. So the penultimate culmination of the 18-year, 219-day cycle will be ending in 2004, 2005. It takes place over a couple of year period. And so such a big time coming for American Indians in Ohio and around the country, and all eyes will be on Ohio then and be there. So I'll hand it over to Megan, and she'll talk about the Tribal Nations Air Table.
All right, so our Tribal Nations Air Table was part of our grant project with Stepping Out and Stepping Up. We wanted to make sure that we were contacting every nation that we could as simultaneously as we could. So we looked at a variety of sources to find the sale of sovereign tribal nation lands, not only to fund the endowment of the Ohio State University, but also the tribal nations that were originally in Ohio. The Ohio State University has students from both internationally and nationally and within Ohio, and we wanted to make sure that everyone's history was properly represented. One thing that this table does not represent is any earlier treaties between sovereign tribal nations themselves. So if the Cherokee Nation, for instance, had a treaty with the Choctaw Nation and it stated exactly where they lived and it happened to be in Ohio, this is totally made up. This is not a thing. But if they did, this is not included in this table. Working on it, but it's a big data set. We also don't have treaties prior to 1775. We specifically focused on the treaties which are still under the United States government specifically, because those treaties are still legally relevant. So not only does it have a summary of what lands were sold for during the Memorial Act for the Ohio State University, it is also cross-referenced by the endowment sovereign nations. So the land sale happened in such a way that you had many different packages of land that were sold, and they often had several different nations attached to them and different treaties attached to them. So we were trying to, a lot of sources had that information, but very split apart. So this is sort of cross-referenced. So if you were looking for one particular part of the data set, you could find it very, very quickly. It not only includes Ohio, but then also historic documentation that we found to back up, and also if anyone wanted to find more information. And also it includes links to a lot of these sovereign tribal nations have essentially what in some ways functions like our United States Congress and United States Senate, but these are representations of sovereign nations more like the UN. And the National Congress of American Indians and the Great Lakes Intertribal Council, a lot of these nations that we're talking about have political relationships and relationships like a UN in these various congresses, so we have links to them as well. Okay, so the treaties were already transcribed in volumes by Charles Kepler, but he arranged them for the US government, and he arranged them chronologically, which is great until you want to find all the Ohio treaties. And you're looking for where the Ohio treaties are, and it's arranged by when the treaty was signed. And a lot of the treaties were then described as treaties with the Wyandotte, etc. Which, if you knew exactly what treaty and what tribal nations were involved, you could probably find it. But a lot of these tribal nations, like the Shawnee Nation would sign a treaty in I think there's one in 1805, definitely. But then, since then, due to various forced removals, the Shawnee Nation has split into several different sovereign tribal federally recognized tribal nations. So the absentee Shawnee Nation, the Shawnee Nation, and the Eastern Shawnee Tribal Nation. So the treaties didn't necessarily reflect the current political situation. And Charles Royce also created land cession maps, where exactly county by county what each land cession in each treaty represented. And it's roughly numerically by the time chronologically from when the United States signed a treaty. So it doesn't have like, it's not like numerically arranged only in Ohio. It's like this session was created in 1840, so it's 256, but actually sessions 4, 5, and 6 are also in Ohio, but like there's weird gaps in the numbers. So National NAGPRA, which represents protection for American Indians cemeteries and goods that were not respectfully removed from like respectfully sold, like Providence. I don't know how much art history everyone has. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. It's required for the federal government to know which treaties are connected to which tribal nation. The U.S. Forest Service has created a tribal connections map, which includes the GIS data specifically for these Royce sessions. And the High Treaty News GitHub data is location specific by land sale parcel. What the land parcel sold for, which colleges benefit Royce ID number, what treaties and signing nations. But they were all in separate data sets. And if you wanted to cross-reference anything, it was pretty tricky to find like what treaty connected to what GIS location and which tribal nations are currently descendant nations for these treaties. This is just a summary the Ohio State University specifically received. And once again, our values. So specifically for our university, we had 51 Indigenous land cessions over 14 states and 107 federally recognized tribal nations currently of this land sale due to the Morrill Act. We still have 2.5% of our land sale unidentified and 2 treaties which have no known surviving nations. They were out in California. And these are the Royce session numbers at the bottom here. So that is a lot of tribal governments to contact simultaneously and make sure that their voice is being heard. So that's what we're working on doing. So what was missing in the data before were any treaties between tribal nations, treaties between colonial nations, oral traditions of the tribal nations, American Indian created maps, linguistic mapping, art traditions, traditional activities, food and medicine knowledge, sports and games, all kinds of things, which should be represented in our land grant mission and research and reciprocity relationship. Okay, so this data we're hoping will help us to rebuild relationships, connect the American Indian sites specifically in Ohio and in the Midwest with tribal nations in Ohio State University, create respectful collaborative research, cultural connections, collaborative teaching, learning, advancing knowledge, and there will be increasing international and national interest in Ohio and these sites and our tribal relationships. Okay, and I have covered everything. Okay, so this is just general source notes. Okay, so if you're interested, I have this on a list as well if you want it. These are agricultural specific resources about specifically the northeast, because we live in the Northeast, and Indigenous sources and how agriculture was created and used in the Northeast, and American Indian perspectives. So here's this. And then there's also TED Talks as well, specifically talking about Indigenous food use. Okay. So then here's us. And then, let's see. All right. Am I over time yet? Okay.
Thanks, Megan and Marty. Oh, are you? Yeah, you're showing the Airtable now.
I can really quick, or if I'm over time, I'm over time. I didn't set my timer.
Go, go, go.
Okay, I'll be really quick. This is a link which includes the Airtable specifically. It's a little bit like an Excel document, but it's cooler. So it's not only fully digitally online, you can also download it in a form which essentially works in Excel or in Google Sheets. And this is all government data, so it is non-copyrightable. So here's a summary of ours specifically. But what's really cool is when you pull up, say, the Ohio State University, you can see specifically each of the land sessions, and say you wanted to know specifically about this land session, you could see, okay, this is who signed it originally. This is the present nation. If they have any other land sessions within the endowment as well. If how this land was acquired, the link to the map of it, the land sale information. So these include all the tribal nation, 107 tribal nations, and then any notes we have. So then this would be, if you wanted to research it specifically by tribal nation, where they're located, they're currently located, their website, any Royce session numbers. And so then we cross-linked it here. Also, once again, this is the signing tribal nations specifically, and what Royce ID land sale they were associated with, how it was acquired, the link to it, and so on and so forth. And then it's very similar with Ohio as well. The only different thing here would be you can see by county. So for instance, let's see, are you guys in, which county are you guys in today? Look that one up specifically.
I think Green.
Okay. Yeah. So in Greene County, it was under the Treaty of Greenville. And so these are the sovereign tribal nations who ceded land in the Treaty of Greenville specifically. And so there were 39 nations. And these are their historic names at the time of signing. And then we also have images of the exact treaty, the peace pipe that was used at the Treaty of Greenville, survey, the survey line from 1960. This is a summary by a tribal member of the impacts of the treaty. And then here's the list of them. So it's really helpful, especially since we are interested in connecting with these tribal nations and their historic sites within Ohio in different counties to make sure that they are represented when an American Indian site is found within Ohio, that they are involved and fully participatory in this. So then just a quick link series. Here's the Great Lakes Intertribal Council, National Congress of American Indians. This is the specific United States department, which is essentially a diplomatic office with all the over 500 and I think it's 67. The number changes, so I might have it slightly off, of federally recognized sovereign American Indian nations. Then a tribal council of Michigan, and a lot of states have a specific Department of Tribal Relations to speak with these sovereign nations. Ohio is not one of them. And then I guess I will take it back to whoever's next.
Okay, thanks, guys. I'm going to share an example of how you can use some of these data to answer a specific question. Let's see, share screen. What happened to PowerPoint? That's right, we had to go to PowerPoint first. Works a little differently here, guys. So just give us a sec. Thought we had that up. There we go. So you want to do this first or share first? Mhm. Get rid of that. We want to share first or do this first? Share first. Yeah. Steps. All right. All right, so when we wrote that racial equity grant, there was an expectation of doing some research, asking a few questions about the injustice that we were studying. So there was some research done as part of that racial equity seed grant, and I'll cover a little bit of that work. So one of the, you've seen this table, so the data that Megan has made use of and others have as well, that's in the land-grant university data, is in a GitHub file. You can get that, and it has a very detailed spreadsheet with a lot of information about each of those parcels. We could use that to trace from those historic tribes to modern day tribes and begin the process of starting a conversation. We were successful, we being largely a scholar named Rick Williams, who's in Colorado, and we engaged him in contacting some of these tribes. He's a historian and Native American scholar. He has a lot of history with the tribal colleges. So he contacted a number of tribes. Now this was during a pandemic. They've got some other things on their mind, so it was not that easy to make these contacts, but Rick did a lot of work and came up with pretty deep conversations with about 12 leaders of tribes. Some of the things that came out of that is this is going to take an ongoing dialogue. It's not going to be quick and easy. There's action that could be taken across the land grant and teaching, research, and community engagement, and that both storytelling and data can help develop the leverage for advocacy for both the truth and reconciliation sides of our work. And there is a paper you can find on this part of the work. One of the things that Steve mentioned is that there has been a focus on food security, the impacts of this dispossession on food security for the tribes. And that is one thing that you can use these data to start looking at. So we have in that GitHub data and now in the pivot table that Megan shared, the exact coordinates of all of these sessions. So you can go back and look at the land that was taken and ask questions like, and these are questions that I had helped put into the racial equity seed grant. How does food security on those parcels that were taken compare with food security on the land that those tribes wound up on? And so if you compare the two, are they actually on being dispossessed of some land and then going on to land where food security or food production potential is less or greater? How does it compare with Ohio? These are the kinds of questions that you could start asking if you know exactly the land that was taken and have data on food production and food security. So the food production data means going to other data sets. We use the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, NRCS. That's based largely on corn yield and things like that. So it's a very different kind of food production than the Native American tribes would have been using. But it gives you some idea of, okay, what's the productivity of the land, at least by that measure. And then food security data came from Feeding America, where they have food security statistics at county level. So again, in comparing the land that was taken with land where tribes ended up, you could look at a 3% decrease overall in food security and about a 27% decrease in food production between the land that was taken and the land where the tribes are now, which is a really broad average that you really have to look at in greater detail. Now, I want to make it very clear, actually, before I even go on, getting from this question of what's the comparative food security and what, how would you answer that question? Where would you find the data? That's a part I can contribute. The people that actually did the work here were Michael Charles, who was a postdoc at Ohio State. He's just starting at Cornell. So he's in the midst of closing on his house and trying to get from point A to point B today. Otherwise, he'd be here giving this talk. So I'm kind of standing in for Michael, who actually did the bulk of the work with help from Kevin Armstrong, who is the Agro-Ecosystems Management Program database manager, or database GIS database data application developer for the AMP program. So I want to make it clear that it's their work that I'm going through only because Michael could not be here today. So if you start breaking it down by the various tribes who had land dispossessed, you can see some of them wound up on land. This is change in food productivity, again, based on the commodity index, so not necessarily the food productivity according to the agriculture that would have been used by the tribe, but by a measure of productivity. You see a few of the tribes that actually wound up on land where the productivity is higher in commodity standards, but for the most case, it's lower, and sometimes quite a bit lower. If you go to how that changes to or translates to food security rate, once again, let's get smaller for a minute. There are a few cases where the land now has higher food security rates than the land that was dispossessed. But for the most part, the land that was taken versus the land that was taken has much higher food security rates than the land where the tribes are now. So you see those big decreases across the board. You can break that down further and look at it by the size of the dispossession. So larger circles mean greater area taken. And now this is putting the change in food production going left to right, where going right is higher production potential where the tribes are now rather than lower. And on the other axis up and down is change in food security rate. So going higher as food security is getting higher, going lower, it's getting lower. So a good direction would be up to the upper left. Where are we going? Sorry. Good direction would be going up to the upper right. You're going in the wrong direction if you're going down to the lower left. And you can see there are tribes, some of the tribes out in California that wound up gaining, at least in terms of production potential on the land, where they ended up. But you have tribes that lost both production potential and quite a bit of shift in food security rates to lower rates. And most of them are kind of pushing over here to the left, especially on the food security rates. Once again, boiling this down to the nations with the largest sessions, and I think the ones in red were, I'll have to look that up. So taking the 10 top and 10 bottom in terms of food security, these are the 10 tribes that gained the most in terms of food productivity or food production potential. And some of those gained quite a bit. Pretty large drops for the bottom 10. And then if you go to food security rates, again, the top 10, there is a number of tribes that did wind up on land where food security rates are a little higher than they are in the land that they left behind in the dispossession, but there are some that have lost quite a bit in terms of food security rate. So this is just one example of, if you start piecing together different data sets and compare it with that landgrabuniversity.org data on these dispossessions, you could start asking questions that allow you to start speaking truth to power and speaking truth about the dispossession and the impact that it has had. And one of the reasons that we focused on that food security piece of it is that our work was very connected with INFACT, the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation. I was the faculty director at the time, and my partner in leading INFACT was Brian Snyder, the executive director. And I'm going to turn it over to Brian at this point to talk a little bit more about specifically the impact on food security. So Brian, take it away.
Yeah, so remind me what time this session was supposed to end.
5:30, so we can go, you got your 10
Okay.
minutes, and then we'll open up the conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to run through my points kind of quickly because this has been a lot of information that I'm sure people may want to ask questions about. My aim really is to, since this is a teaching educational conference about sustainable ag, to really kind of just make some very broad points about what are the implications in terms of indigenous food systems for sustainable ag education today. As Casey said, I'm the former executive director of INFACT, the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation. And since there's somebody in the room from Penn State, you'll be glad to know that the background there, which is a picture from my front porch, is actually the friendly confines of Happy Valley, looking towards State College. So you might recognize some of the hillsides there. Let me see here. I've got 3 screens going, so I need to make sure I'm advancing slides to the correct one. So the first point I'd want to make in terms of teaching in sustainable ag is we hear so much about the green. Everybody that's there, I'm sure, understands that what is meant by the Green Revolution is what was brought about primarily by Norman Borlaug and the utilization of agricultural inputs, fertilizers, and other kinds of chemical inputs that greatly increased the volume of production mostly for grains around the world following World War II. And it had a huge impact, of course, on the ability of farmers around the world to be able to produce vastly increased amounts of grain in particular. And so that's what's usually, that's what's meant by the Green Revolution. And there's a lot of Green Revolution coming about because of genetic modification. But it really deserves attention to stop and think about, okay, so what came before all of this? And what I'm calling the first great Green Revolution, this quote from Jack Woodford's book, Indian Givers from 1988, which is a book that I picked up soon after it was published, and it really kind of turned me on to this whole subject, that the quote unquote discovery of America had a huge impact on the world because of the foods that were found here, the foods that were being propagated by native indigenous tribes in North and South America. They had a tremendous impact, and in fact, in many ways, saved Europe from plagues, from repeated famine. And it's important to understand that without the foods that were found already in production here, the rest of the world would look very different today. And I just want to give some examples. For instance, these are of course different kinds of potatoes that were propagated. There are 3,000 varieties of potatoes that were propagated in the Western Hemisphere. So this is just a very small selection. Just a few of these resemble what you might find in a grocery store now. But potatoes had a huge impact on European culture and also elsewhere in the world. I mean, if you think about it, even Indian food, for instance, as in from India, heavily relies on potatoes even today. The Irish relied heavily on potatoes, and because they only had 3 varieties of potatoes, the potato famine that killed came about because they didn't have the kind of diversity that had been developed by native tribes in the Americas beforehand, and didn't have anywhere near the kind of diversity you see in this picture, for instance. And of course, corn is the same story, the kind of diversity. I mean, and there were hundreds of varieties. So this is just a small selection, and only a couple of these are similar to what we might recognize as corn grown on farms, whether in the United States or elsewhere in the world. What a huge impact this crop had on the entire world and continues to have. Even in the last 24 hours, we've heard so much about the discussion about grain that is stuck in Ukraine and not able to be shipped around the world, causing food insecurity. And there was an agreement between Russia and Ukraine to be able to get some of that out. And then after they signed that agreement, Russia promptly bombed the area that was supposed to be shipping it, at least one of the areas. So it's politically a very important crop. It completely changed the world. There was no corn in the world other than in the Western Hemisphere before the time of European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. And these are illustrations from the 16th century of the first tomato plants that were brought over. Think about the war, think about Europe without tomatoes. Think about Italy without tomatoes. Think about what the rest of the world was like without these 3 principal crops, but there were many others as well, including peppers. Think about what it has meant to Asian cuisine to have peppers of various kinds. And chocolate was not a crop or a product familiar in the rest of the world until Europeans. I keep, you trip over the word discover, because what they discovered was already something very much in process here in North and South America. So it's important to remember, and I always refer to it as the first green revolution, that it was due to indigenous North and South American food systems that the cuisines and the culture around the world changed dramatically, even more so than what we call the Green Revolution or what the next Green Revolution might bring about. It's also important to remember that this is an excerpt from an essay that I wrote back in 2016 on my blog. It's important to remember that nearly every technique that we think about as sustainable agriculture these days, sometimes called regenerative agriculture now is a more popular term, organic farming, lots of different ways to refer to it, but almost every aspect of what we teach as sustainable, regenerative, organic agriculture had its roots in indigenous food systems. You can find the antecedents to what we're teaching today in our land-grant universities in indigenous practices. And of course, an entire presentation can be made on this topic alone, an entire class, an entire degree can be done looking at the connections between indigenous food systems and sustainable ag practices. There are books coming out every year now on this topic, and the amount of scholarship coming out on this topic is accelerating quite quickly. So I won't go into any more depth, but this is another point, another consideration for teaching, is to remind people that what we're learning today and thinking about doing for the future had its roots in ancient agriculture. And so this is an example. Interestingly, and Marty, I don't know if you or Megan or John have ever been to Peru, but this is a site called Moray in Peru near Urubamba, and the development of these sites in Peru was roughly coincident with the earthworks. So it's interesting to think about the things going on in North and South America at roughly the same time. By the way, just to remind everybody that when Columbus quote unquote discovered America, there were already bigger cities here than London and Paris and Rome at the time. So who was discovering who is a good question to ask. But this, basically, just to cut to the chase, was an agricultural experiment station in Peru, and the scale of this is enormous. You can see a couple of little darker dots at different points in this circle, and those are people. But just to kind of give you a better idea, there's a picture from just about 4 rings up from the bottom, looking down with a person right in front of me and then people down in the bottom. This site is huge, and when you look at that entire set of terraces, even this photo is only capturing about 1/4 of the entire site. What this was an experiment station where they developed different crops. There's DNA evidence of as many as 6,000 different fruits and vegetables that were being grown in this site. And the way that the landscape was used here, with these terraces facing in different direction and in different elevations, different access to water, they could reproduce. So this was the Incas, of course, in pre-Columbian times doing this work. They could reproduce the conditions almost anywhere in the Inca Empire right in this site, so that they could develop varieties of fruits and vegetables that could be grown anywhere throughout the empire. And why did they do this? Why did they need to do this experimentation? Well, they had some pretty extreme situations. I'm sure you all recognize this as Machu Picchu, and this is one of the most extreme development sites in the Inca world. So extreme and remote that, of course, it wasn't even discovered by the Spanish conquerors. It wasn't discovered until long after, hundreds of years after. But what you can see is the same kind of terrace work used in the development of this site. And these terraces, they perform three different functions, at least three, all of which were represented back in what I was calling the experiment station in Moray. One is that they're structural. Very obviously, the city depends on those terraces for its own foundation, for being able to stabilize a site to build a city. Secondly, every one of those terraces acts as a reservoir holding water. And as they have been excavated, these terraces have been shown to be built almost perfectly to hold water in place, with different sized stones and gravel and sand used very strategically in order to hold water for a maximum amount of time in place, so it didn't just run off. And of course, then the third thing is food production, and that's best exhibited on the other side of the mountain here from the city, where most of the food production occurred. In fact, those are granaries in the middle of the picture in the distance there. The whole mountainside was used for food production, in addition to the terraces around the city. So, you know, when I look at this, and I think, you know, as Marty was saying, you know, the genius of these people. The genius of these people is just incredible. There is nothing that we do on experiment stations today that would even come close to the magnitude of the kinds of things that they were accomplishing then. As Neil Young said in a song, Cortez the Killer said, they built up with their bare hands what we still can't do today. And if you think about it, it's true. What construction crew can do this today? But what they did is that the food system here was the foundation of this community, of this city. And this was a remote retreat for royals within the Inca community. But every city, before it was destroyed by the Spanish, was built this way. It was built first and foremost with thought to food and water. Literally the architecture was incorporated into the construction of communities and cities with food and water as a priority. What if we were doing that today? What if we were building cities today with that as our priority, rather than assuming that, well, we'll grow all of that out in the countryside, and we'll keep reservoirs out in the countryside. There will always be water. We'll tell people in California today that there will always be water. We have not built our cities nearly with this kind of wisdom in mind. So I included a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer here to talk about the give and take that is involved between human beings and communities and plants. In particular, you can include livestock in this discussion as well. But we need to have these indigenous systems and the genius of what came before us in mind as we think about planning for the regeneration and resilience that we're going to need in the future. There is more knowledge behind us than in front of us. And we're losing more of it behind us than we're discovering in front of us. By looking both ways, we can maximize our ability to develop sustainable and regenerative systems that we're going to need in the future. This is a depiction of what the Aztecs were doing. And if you look at this, you can say, well, this is a futuristic picture. This is something, for the extended future. But no, this is what the Aztecs were doing to feed hundreds of thousands of people. They knew how to do this in extreme conditions. We need to rediscover this. In fact, it was a discovery theme, but I like to tell people we actually were, in many respects, a rediscovery theme. This is an article about the garden beds that were arrayed around the Great Lakes. John Lau is originally from northern Indiana and southwest Michigan area, his tribe. These garden beds, some of them comprised hundreds of acres, were arrayed around Lake Michigan on both sides. And there are no stones here. It was all done with just soil and was all destroyed by the plow. So these illustrations were literally created before the farmer's plow, the European farmer's plow, hit these areas. And so you can no longer, except in very small areas, go and see what happened. But the kind of experimentation they were doing with different patterns of raised beds and different patterns for irrigation, this is futuristic. We need to rediscover this. This is what they were doing before we discovered it and destroyed it. I like to talk about, I developed this slide for use in a graduate law seminar at UCLA Law School, where I was asked to give a little bit of a lecture about why any of this matters, why future lawyers should be wondering why we should care about indigenous food systems or where our own food system came from. And so there's a bit of there's a lot of oversimplification here, but I was doing it for law students. I wanted them to understand, and I think you'll see where I ended up with this, where there's some profound realities that I think we all can recognize by breaking things down the way I have here. Our colonial food system had two very significant inputs that we can't underestimate the importance of. One is free land, and we took the land as needed. And that's exhibited by what happened with indigenous lands that not only were used for the founding of land-grant universities, but for the founding of 50 states and all of the land that we're on. When the land was used up, they moved on and took other land. But it was always presumed that there was always going to be more land and it was going to be basically free. We also had an assumption of free labor. And these are the original sins of the American food system today. We imported the labor in the form of slaves, and that became an important foundational input to our food system just as much as the free land. With those two inputs, that led to our modern agricultural food practice and policy. And this is where I was really making this point to lawyers that actually, before we got to this point, our modern practices and policy, we could have turned back somewhere in history, and we could have taken account of what, of these original inputs, these original sins. We could have made amends along the way. But we didn't. We pushed on. And what is the effect? Well, we have some impacts. And these impacts, I argue, are not accidental. Because of the devaluation of land and the devaluation of labor that originally went into our food system, we have some environmental impacts that are very familiar to all of you and are in the news on a daily basis. Soil degradation, water contamination, and climate change are some of the principal environmental impacts that we're experiencing. And there are human impacts, including health challenges, economic disparities, Columbus, Ohio, is one of the cities that has one of the fastest growing economies in the country, but it also is number 2 or 3 in the country in terms of disparities between neighborhoods. Huge disparities in terms of food security between neighborhoods in Columbus and throughout the Rust Belt, but also elsewhere in the country. And of course, the immigration crisis, you know, there's no mistaking that the immigration crisis, what's happening at the southern border, it is the legacy of our assumption of free labor. And only we've, quote unquote, improved it in some ways from the point of view, from the facetious point of view of modern agricultural systems. Rather than importing slaves that end up staying, we bring workers in and we send them home without giving them the benefit of the benefits that U.S. citizenship would afford them, including the right to vote. It's undeniable the connection between these original assumptions in our food system and some of these impacts that we're dealing with today. And together, I think you would recognize all of these impacts as being labeled some of the externalized costs of the food system, which, by the way, have been studied very thoroughly. And just last year, the Rockefeller Foundation put out a very thorough report showing the externalized costs involved in the food system. And this is just a quote from their executive summary, saying that because of externalized costs, what we actually pay for food is less to feed the world. And the biggest externalized costs are the impacts that I just covered: human health and environment. So this is why we need to care. This is why we need to go back and make amends. We need to correct these things now, because without a complete understanding of these original sins in our food system and the need to correct those, we cannot correct the impacts that we're going to have to address for the long-term future. And I think all of us involved in this work understand that. There's a movement afoot to talk about indigenizing the food system, or at least providing food sovereignty is the latest kind of concept, especially in terms of working with indigenous communities, providing them with the ability to honor their own traditions, their own practices, their own crops, their own food system, which after all did already save the world once. And I would contest can save the world again. This is my last slide. I'm just ending with this thought that by promoting food sovereignty among Native tribes and among people of color and BIPOC communities in general, the concept of food sovereignty is something that is relevant to everybody in agriculture. And all of us that are more representative of the settler culture that has benefited for centuries now by basically mining what was made available to us here in this hemisphere. So that's the end.
Good.
Casey.